Floating staircases seem to be making a strong trend upward. And for good reason. I mean, look at that.
It looks nice.
Yeah, it looks pretty sweet.
And I've had several requests before to build a set of stairs or take some sort of staircase remodel, and I've always said no. Frankly, because I've just been too intimidated by the job. But when a friend of mine who was opening up a commercial space for her business reached out and said, "Can you build me a staircase?" I still said no, until she shared that there was already a temporary staircase up to code in place that I could just use the current setup as a reference point to build a nicer staircase. Then I said maybe, but she was clearly confident that I could figure it out even though I lacked the confidence, so we struck up a deal despite me saying that this was totally new territory for me, as my focus is cabinetry and furniture. A job like this has some serious structural implications, and I have to make this thing safe, and we have to pass an inspection. So I took some measurements and headed back to the shop. The look we are going for is a minimalist and floating style staircase. It consists of a center stringer that will carry the weight of 15 stair treads of solid ash at 3 3/4 inches thick, along with black half-inch square-shaped balusters and an ash handrail. So we'll start off by building the center stringer. Usually stairs have at least 3 stringers made from a single 2x12. In this case, we're building one stringer made from 3 2x12s that will all get glued together into one giant mega stringer. Additionally, we're also going to be building a platform for the staircase to make a quarter turn, which adds a bit of complexity to the whole thing. I spent many nights brainstorming in my sleep about how I was going to make this work, and to be honest, at this point during the build, I had no idea how I was going to do it. I just had to start building pieces and putting them together to see what was going to work and what wasn't. So at this point, I'm just concerned with getting these 2x12s glued straight enough before I take them to the joiner to get straight edges on both sides. You heard me right. I'm going to put this 14-foot long 6x12 through my 54-inch long joiner. Just you wait. It's a sight to see. And as I'm getting these glued together, I'm beginning to grow more confident in the overall strength of this single stringer, simply due to its weight. However, I'm also hoping that I'll reduce some of the weight once I begin cutting all of the notches out for the stair treads. And while the glue dries, I'll get the short stringer for the quarter turn and the other supports made for the platform glued together, even though at this point I don't know how I'm going to use them. And now that the clamps are removed, I can deliver on my promise, and with the gracefulness of a ballerina, I can glide this stringer across the joiner with the ease of shooting a fish in a barrel. Seriously, why do I always put myself in these positions? I should probably have another person helping me. Actually, I should probably have another feed roller. Actually, I should probably have a bigger joiner. Hang on, I'm going to go show this footage to my wife and ask for a bigger joiner. Hey babe, can I have a bigger joiner? She still said no. Anyways, these parts are going to be painted, so I'm going to take time now to get some voids filled and sanded before the layout of the treads. As you can see, the depth of the saw reaches about 2 inches deep, and when I cut both sides, that leaves about a ½ inch left to cut manually with the Ryoba saw. So let's get into the details of laying out a stringer. I found this website, calculator.net, and it has a stair calculator, and it does a really good job of explaining the terminology. Remember those measurements I took at the beginning of the video? Well, this is where they get plugged in. I know that the total rise is 93.27 inches and the total run is 118.38 inches. I also know that there will be a total of 15 steps, but only 12 of those steps will be on the upper stringer and 3 on the lower stringer. And I want the rise and the run of each step to match the temporary setup, which in this case is 7 1/4, and the run is 10 inches. Lastly, I know that my stair treads will be 3 3/4 inches thick. Once I plug in all that information, the calculator will tell me how long the stringer needs to be and how high my first step will need to be. Another way of saying this is that the calculator is essentially calculating a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Please do not tell my high school math teacher that I'm using real math in real life for my real job. So once the layout is done, then comes the tedious process of cutting out all of the notches for the treads. Normally this wouldn't be so bad, but because the stringer is 4.5 inches thick, I've got to make twice the amount of cuts since my track saw only goes about 2 inches deep. And the same as before, I'll use the Ryoba saw to finish out the cuts. By the way, these Ryoba saws by Temple Tools in Michigan are a real delight to work with. And I found myself using this saw so many times for this project. Even though this probably isn't the right saw for the job, it's what I had on hand and it worked out just fine. It just took a while. I'll include an Amazon link in the description. Knowing this is going to be painted, I didn't want the surface of exposed end grain to be the face of the front of the steps as you're walking up the stairs, so I grabbed some 1/4-inch ply to cover up those edges and routed them flush. Technically, that changes the depth of my run, and I didn't account for that when I did my layout, but most codes have a range of a staircase run, and I was still within that deviation, so no harm there. And then it was time to repeat the process for the lower stringer, and I had to begin thinking seriously about how I was going to put together this platform. If you remember, the upper stringer is going to be mounted on this lower platform, and the goal here is a floating look. So how am I going to get the platform to appear floating without adding supports? Well, you're still going to have to hang on until install, but for now, I'm essentially making a thick half lap that connects to the lower stringer, which will be joined together on site. For cutting these half laps, there's a couple ways to do this. You can use the circular saw to make a series of passes within the wayside so that the pieces can be chipped out, or you can do as I did and use the Ryoba saw again and use a Forstner bit to remove a bulk of the material and a chisel to knock the rest out. I tried both methods and preferred the latter. I wanted a snug fit, but decided not to test fit all the way because I wanted to ensure that I could take the joint apart. That way I could trim down those pieces later if needed. And you may notice in the paint room that the lower stringer has now been attached to one of the larger supports. I didn't show it, but I ended up joining up those two pieces together with a combination of large dominoes, wood glue, and framing nails to get the strongest joint I could possibly do. And with all of that work, I haven't even begun the stair treads yet, and it's time to empty the dust collector. For this project, I ordered 250 board feet of 8/4 ash, which is a fantastic alternative to the oh-so-popular white oak these days. It's significantly less expensive, and on the Yonka scale, it rates just slightly softer than white oak, but harder than red oak. It's also incredibly similar to white oak in appearance, and to be honest, sometimes I can't tell the difference between them side by side, and can only tell if I make a cut and smell the sawdust, because ash stinks like ash. So we're going to be making 15 treads at 40 inches long by 10 3/4 inches deep by 3 3/4 inches thick. Each tread will be made from 4 boards at roughly 5.5 inches wide so that I can fit them through my small joiner, and they'll get glued up in 2 stages to build up to the desired dimensions. First, I glued 2/4 up to thickness to make a half, and then I'd glued 2 halves to make a whole. So if you do the math, that's a total of 30 separate glue ups just for the stair treads alone. This job wasn't hard, it just took a long time just to get to the point of having them ready to be sanded, which, by the way, was a full day's work in and of itself. Each step took about 20 minutes of straight sanding, and that's with using a belt sander first, and then coming back with the orbital sander through the grits up to 180 grit. In the end, it took about 6 hours of straight sanding for all 15 steps. And while we're at it, I'm guessing that I'll get asked which sandpaper I use, so what I use is 3M Extract for most of my large surface projects. I've tested plenty of other sandpapers out there, and either 3M Extract or Cubitron are simply unmatched in their finish quality and rate of material removal. Not a sponsor, just a fan of the product. And once sanded, each tread will get a 1/8 inch roundover over all of the edges before finishing. And finally, we can begin the install. The temporary stairs were removed by the general contractor crew so I could get started on a blank slate. Fortunately, there were plenty of marks on the walls left over from where the stairs were before, so I could see if I was lining up as planned. Starting with the lower stringer, I originally mounted this piece to the wall with a joist hanger. I did this temporarily until I figured out a better way to mount this piece to the wall. And then I hammered in place the half-lap joint and then secured the half-lap with 6-inch long lag screws. Okay, so let's pause here for a second. You'll notice that the upper stringer is installed, and unfortunately I don't have footage of that going in, as I noticed that the camera stopped recording immediately after I hit record, and I wasn't about to reinstall it considering I was helped by the GC on site. But I'll give you a rundown on how this is all being brought together. Starting with the base, you'll notice that I used the cross beams to build the skeleton of the platform with 2x6s. This gave me more stability and access to studs across the wall, which I used 1/4-inch by 4-inch long lag screws to secure the base to the wall. I also used a joist hanger to support the stringer and added L brackets with 1/4-inch lag screws to reinforce the joint, and also used those same brackets to secure the upper stringer to the top of the staircase. For extra stability, I secured the bottom of the lower stringer to the concrete floor using a pair of 1/2-inch by 5-inch long concrete anchors. Once that was secured, I could finally start installing the treads. Again, I woke up many nights considering how I was going to secure these treads to the stringer in a manner that could hold the weight of someone standing on the edge. Many jobs out there have some sort of welded seal for this part of the job, and while that would be my first choice, I was not necessarily given the budget to have parts like that made. Luckily for me, there are some budget-friendly home center options that will work. I found these Simpson brackets used in decking and painted them black to match the stringer. I situated them on one side and mounted the others to the wall. I figured this would spread the weight across the tread rather than have everything forced to the center. I used a total of 30 brackets with 8 lag screws each. That's 240 lags supporting these steps. Once all the treads were in and I was confident that the weight could be properly supported, I could head back to the shop and start building the handrails. At this point, it's Sunday and inspection is tomorrow. There's no way I'm going to be done by then. I pressed on, built the 3x3 posts and handrails, I sanded them and finished them, and then headed back to the site to begin installing them into position. I used a laser level to line up the handrail posts and screwed them with black lag screws. On Monday morning, I only had the posts in and then began installing the upper level handrail across the loft, finishing just one section before the inspector arrived. At this point, I had put in so much hard work into this project with no clue as to what the inspector was going to say. For all I knew, I'd have to scrap the whole project and start over. Fortunately for all of us, the inspector was very relaxed. He checked the height of the rail, which needed to be between 34 and 38 inches high, which it was about 36 inches high. He also checked the spacing of the balusters, which needed to be less than 4 inches. He just placed his fist between the posts as a gauge for spacing and said it was good. And then he also walked up and down the stairs. That's it. He had zero questions or concerns about the structure or what size lag screws I was using. We passed inspection before I was done, in faith that I'd finished the job. So I did what anyone else would do. I took the money and ran without finishing the job.
Oh, in the movie, they catch up to him half-mile down the road and slit his throat.
It was a good one.
Just kidding. Of course I finished the job, and now I could finally relax a little bit and get the job done. It turns out that installing the balusters was the most tedious part of the whole job. There are a few ways people do this, and I'm not saying the way that I'm presenting here was the most efficient way to do this, but I was able to make it work and keep the balusters secured into position. For starters, the upper handrails were much easier to assemble because each of the balusters could be pre-cut to the same length. Once the handrails were cut to size and all the balusters were cut, I could then insert the baluster into the bottom and then attach the top rail to the rest of the balusters before screwing the handrail into final position. The handrails going up and down the stairs are a bit trickier. First, those handrails needed to be cut and installed into position before putting in the balusters. Each of these balusters had to be cut at separate lengths based on where the pre-drilled holes were. For each distance between step and rail, I added about 1/4 to 1/2 inch extra to fit the baluster into position with the holes drilled extra deep so I could theoretically insert one end and drop them down into position. This didn't work as smoothly as I had hoped. The holes were a bit too snug for the balusters, but like I said, I was able to get everything into position in the end and was thoroughly pleased with the result. One of the ways I've seen other people avoid this problem is to use baluster shoes, which allow for drilling oversized holes and then covering the holes with the shoes. There's nothing wrong with this, I just opted for a more minimalist look. So once all 60 plus balusters were installed, I could tidy up the platform with some custom trim and call the job done. After I finished, there was still some drywall work to be completed by the GC, but I think you get the idea. And now if you'll excuse me, I've got a winter ball to get ready for. Okay, I'm sorry, I've just always wanted to do that. You probably just want to see some final glamour shots, so here you go. In all seriousness, I am super proud of how this project came out. I wasn't kidding when I was considering not taking this job on, but I think those are the jobs you grow the most from when you take on something bigger than you think you can handle. I put a lot of time into this project as well as the video and really hope you enjoyed watching, whether you learned or laughed or hopefully both. Thank you.